Just want to clarify two types of interests in commonly owned oil and gas. So, like the bundle of sticks, you can divide the interest through the gas lease. One of these types of interests is the working interest. It's the lessee's interest under an oil and gas lease is called the working interest, sometimes called the operating interest. It carries the exclusive right to explore, develop, and produce from the property, as well as the obligation to pay 100% of the cost of exploration, development, and production. In other words, during the terms of the oil and gas lease, the lessee gets all the incidents of mineral ownership except those specifically reserved to the lessor in the oil and gas lease. A working interest lasts as long as the lease lasts, excuse me. A working interest lasts as long as the lease lasts. And while it lasts, the lessee has the exclusive right to develop the property for oil and gas. When the lease terminates, the incidents of mineral ownership conveyed to the lessee under the lease revert to the lessor. In classic real property estate terms, working interest is a fee simple determinable estate, because a working interest lasts as long as the lease lasts. When the lease terminates, the incidents of the mineral ownership conveyed to the lessee under the lease revert to the lessor. Classic real property estate terms, the working interest is a fee simple determinable. The second type of interest I want to discuss is the royalty interest. The lessor's interest under the oil and gas lease is called a royalty interest. A royalty interest is a share in production which is free of the costs of production. A royalty interest is a non-possessory interest with no operating rights. This black letter definition does not fully explain the concept of royalty interest, so that's why I don't want to get into the kinds of them. Conceptually, what are royalty interests and what are they often created in oil and gas? Why are they? In layman's terms, a royalty is a form of compensation which used when value is speculative. It is a hedge against uncertainty. While commonly used in oil and gas transactions, royalty interests are not limited to oil and gas. Artistic creations, such as granting percentage of the revenue from movies, books, or records, are areas in which royalties are commonly used as a means of compensation. So there's three different kinds of royalties that are common in oil and gas transaction. The difference is based on the way in which the royalty interest is created. Lease royalty interest, LRI. The LRI, lease royalty interests, are the most common type of royalty interest. The lessor's interest in production under the oil and gas lease. In most Texas oil and gas leases, the royalty clause relating to the typical oil typically reads as follows. Royalty to be paid to lessee are as follows. On oil, 1/8 that is produced and saved from said land. This clause literally means what it says. 1/8 of all the oil produced for the lessor's land belongs to the lessor. Overriding royalty interest, an ORI is a non-cost bearing interest carved out of the working interest. X oil's 7/8 of production in the hypo above. ORI are frequently used to compensate the geologist who developed the prospect, the landman who took the lease, and others who perform services for the lease. They are created when the lessee assigns a lease but reserves an overriding royalty for itself. ORIs, like LRIs, are creatures of the oil and gas lease, and both end when the lease term ends. And the third one is non-participating royalty interest, NPRI. The third type of royalty interest is conveyed to reserve by a present or former mineral royalty owner. X sells, here's a hypo, an example. X sells the family homestead, Blackacre, and moves to the city, but in his deed to buyer, X reserves 1/2 of any royalty Y may receive on production from Blackacre. Under this reservation, X is entitled to share the royalty on production of oil and gas. Other minerals from Blackacre, if oil and gas or other minerals are ever found and produced from the property. An NPRI can be perpetual and can be limited in time. The NPRI is carved out of the LRI as opposed to the ORI. being carved out of the working interest. Since the MPRI does not relate to a particular lease, unlike the LRI or ORI, it does not end when the lease ends. Rather, it generally is tied to the land. And those are the royalty interests I wanted to discuss. Essentially, lease royalty interest is you get to reserve some. You own the land, you're severing the minerals, and you're giving it to the oil company. You reserve at least 1/8, at least in that hypo. Overriding royalty interest is carved out of the working interest. So of that 7/8, you can use that to pay the landmen, the geologists, and all sorts of stuff, operating costs. Non-participatory saying royalty interests go to issues such as the initial lease of royalty interest. Well, it's already been cut in half, so then everything else is a half of that, so you're dividing it. And that's what I wanted to cover.